Hi, this is Scott Stripling. I'm coming to you from the Bible Seminary, and this is our First Fridays podcast. We're looking forward to having you on campus on September the 21st from 9:30 to 3:30. Details will be on the screen, and folks go to thebibleseminary.edu to sign up for the seminar. And it's about a book that you and Dr. Evans co-wrote called Jesus and the Jihadis. So when you guys wrote this book, I think it was about 10 years ago, I remember saying this is going to be one of the most important books of this decade because we're dealing with the rise of Islam as a militant force in various forms. So Dr. Evans, tell us a little bit about the theological underpinnings of Islam and why we as Christian leaders should care about this.
Yeah, well, we certainly should care about it. The basic core belief of Islam, there is one God. Of course, we all agree with that. They prefer the generic name Allah. Okay, fine. And they believe that the only really true prophet, the last great prophet to give us the final truth, is Muhammad. And of course, God didn't speak in Muhammad's ear directly. He spoke to Muhammad through Gabriel, the angel. And so, unlike the Bible, which is a small library made up of 66 books, 40 plus authors, humanly speaking, the Quran has only one author, well, that we know of officially, and that's Muhammad. And so, it's a very different book. The Bible has different genres. Quran is just one thing. It's a meditation and an argument. And so, why do we need to know about it? Because the Quran reinterprets biblical material, biblical characters, and basically negates the Jewish tradition that God worked through Abraham's son Isaac. And in the Quran and Islamic belief, no, it's through his firstborn son Ishmael. And that has caused the problem down through the centuries. Ever since the 7th and 8th centuries, Muhammad died in 632. The Quran is probably finished 100 years later. And that's why what we're seeing in the Middle East right now is a result of that difference.
Jeremiah, what are some of those theological underpinnings of Islam that bring us into some of the conflicts that we're seeing in the Middle East today?
Well, and Dr. Stripling, if you don't mind, even before I get into the theological underpinnings, I want to talk about how important this conversation is and why I hope everyone who's listening will come to our course at the Bible Seminary in 2 weeks. I was stunned years and years ago, long before I wrote the book Jesus and Jihadis. I happened to be doing ministry one night with the great missionary Don Richardson. He wrote a famous book called Peace Child. So if anyone knows international missions out there, you know the name Don Richardson, you know the great work he did internationally for Jesus Christ for a generation. The event was not about Islam, but in the last 5 minutes before we closed the event, all of a sudden, Don, and I was there, I have it on recording, he said, now I want to talk about the greatest threat that Christianity faces today. It is Islam, and Christians are unprepared. And it was a prophetic voice in that moment saying every believer needs to understand the greatest threat that we face as a faith community isn't necessarily false teaching, that's bad, or isn't the rise of skepticism, it is the rise of Islam. And that got my attention because I, like many who are watching and listening to this podcast, knew very little to nothing about Islam. I just knew what I heard in the headlines. I knew nothing about what they really believe. Could it really be that bad? I mean, what does the Quran actually say? And it sent me down this odyssey of wanting to know how to reach Muslims with the gospel. We're not just interested in doing polemics. We're not just trying to tear down other faith movements. We want to reach these people with the truth and the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but we have to know something about their belief systems to be able to reach them. And so I took that to heart. And then Dr. Evans and I wanted to write a book that in 3 hours of reading, you would know more about Islam than 80% of the Muslims in the world. And in 3 hours of reading Jesus and the Jihadis, the coolest thing that has come out of the book and why it's still in print 10 years later is you're going to learn how to reach Muslims with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yes, we're going to train you and equip you with the theological underpinnings of Islam. And we're going to talk about, I mean, very critically, the text of the Quran, what we have today, what we know is the Quran. We're going to talk about if Muhammad, if he even existed as we know him today. We talk about all those things, but there is a true comparison between Jesus Christ and Muhammad. 91 times in the Quran, Muhammad is said to be someone of perfect or excellent character. Well, was he? When we look at the Quran, back to the theological underpinnings question, many believers don't realize that Islam has a theological rational text base. There's really three books. There's the Quran, Sirah, and Hadith. The Quran, this big bad Quran that we hear about, it's actually smaller than the New Testament, Dr. Stripling. And it's actually arranged in chronological order. There's 114 chapters. The longest is at the beginning, the shortest is at the end. So it's not even in a chronological order. It's hard to read the Quran. And the Quran that we have today was put together by the Umayyad dynasty. And so there's a lot of those things that we get into in the book that we're going to really get into in the class together.
You know, I sort of liken it to reading Faulkner for those who've read much American literature. It's kind of a stream of consciousness. It's a very different genre. Dr. Evans, let's come back to you for a second. Martin Luther had a copy of the Quran. Why in the world would Martin Luther in the middle of the Reformation be studying the Quran?
Well, what Jeremiah just said, he too realized that Islam was a threat. And back in his day, this may seem strange to us, but Islam had at least a couple of times attempted to overrun Europe. And of course, Vienna, Austria, at one time was under Islamic rule. Muslims not only invaded the heartland of Christianity, the Middle East, but it invaded North Africa. It crossed into Spain. It had conquered all of Spain and southern France. And it wasn't until the 8th century that there was a decisive battle that began to push Islam out of Europe. And it took actually a long time. El Cid, played by Charlton Heston, tells that story. And they finally pushed the Islamic invaders out of Spain, but never pushed them out of North Africa. And so that at one time was part of the classical world, part of the Greco-Roman world. And to this day, it's under the Muslim thumb.
Yeah, I have been.
Well, and if I might add, could I add one thing,
Sure.
Dr. Stripling, to that?
Of course.
When we were in Wittenberg, and this is cool because this is in the book, and we'll be sharing this in the class. We're walking around Wittenberg, and all of a sudden, I see a book called Luther's Quran. And Luther, in his commentaries, Ezekiel 38:39, he exegetes Gog and Magog as Suleiman the Great and the Ottoman Caliphate. He believed he was living in the end of days. Here's an exact quote from Jesus and the Jihadis, as quoted from Luther himself in his commentaries. He wanted to equip European pastors so that, quote, will be able to defend themselves against the faith of Muhammad, even if we're unable to defend ourselves from his sword. So he saw the power of equipping pastors. He did Al Quranis. He did literally a preface to his own Quran in Latin, not in German. Again, he's writing for other pastors, other thought leaders who will be able to speak Latin. And he does essentially what we're going to do 2 weeks from now. He teaches them about the beliefs of the Muhammad men, how to reach them for Jesus Christ, to save them. Not only, we might not be able to save them from their sword, but we can save ourselves from their false theology. I just wanted to throw that tidbit in there.
Awesome. Dr. Steinmetz, let's bring you in. Give us your perspective on why this matters. And then I know you've got a question also for Dr. Evans and Dr. Johnston.
Yeah, why does it matter? We live in a world of, as Paul would say, many gods and many lords, lowercase on both of those. We live in a world of religious diversity and pluralism. And we live in a world where Islam is the only global religion that rivals Christianity in terms of size, in terms of influence, in terms of growth. And so at present, both Islam and Christianity are growing rapidly, almost neck and neck throughout the majority world or global South, and both approaching, somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people each. And the interaction, the confrontation occurs at so many levels. It occurs at an ideological level. It occurs at a spiritual level. It occurs at a political and military level. And it is a confrontation of kingdoms, not specific to Islam, but as Christians who believe that Jesus Christ, as revealed in Scripture, is the only way to salvation. is Lord of heaven and earth, is God incarnate, it is a clash between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. And in that struggle, the casualties are people, people who believe and follow a false God and a false religion. And as ambassadors of Christ, our calling is to rescue the perishing, to take the gospel, the ministry and message of reconciliation out into the world. And there's no larger harvest field, no larger single harvest field in the world today than Islam.
You know, we really emphasize at the Bible Seminary the 1040 window. It's the part of the world where we have the largest unreached people groups, and largely Muslims within that window. And so all of our missionaries, all of our graduates who have gone to the mission field have gone into that 1040 window, rather than to, say, Latin America or Europe and places that certainly need the gospel, but not taking Islam head on. And so this is something that really matters to us. And I know our students are excited about interacting with this information and learning. Dr. Steinmetz, did you have a question you want to
yeah, I've got a few over? I've got a few floating around. Dr. Johnston, I'm curious, the meeting you had with Don Richardson, and I just wanted to throw out another plug for him in addition to Peace Child, Eternity in Their Hearts, another excellent book he did on missiology. When was that? What was the date of that meeting? Do you recall, or the year?
Oh, it would have been early 2000s, right?
Early
I mean,
2000s.
Early 2000s. I should check, but I don't know for sure, but definitely before I was married. So I was married 20 years ago.
Yeah. So I've got the two most recent editions of Elwell's Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, massive, thousands of articles from hundreds of Christian scholars. And this one that I've got, Scott's got the original on his shelf. It's about half the width, right?
Together we have a complete set.
Together we have a complete set.
Yeah.
This second edition, released in 2001, does not have an article on Islam.
Wow.
Doesn't have an article on Muhammad. Doesn't have an article on the Quran. The third edition, published in 2017, corrects that oversight.
Wow.
And this got me thinking about the historical context. Islam has presented a more or less evident threat or confrontation to Christianity at different times in history. So I'd love to hear you and Dr. Evans comment on what is it in the last 25 years that has brought Islam to the fore of Christian discussions and thinking. And I don't think there's any surprises there, but I think it's fascinating. The second edition, published 2001, had it been published a year later, I think it would have had an article on Islam.
Right.
Well, I could add, Israel, I think what's changed is the confrontations between Islam and the non-Islamic world was always violent and aggressive, invading Europe 2 or 3 times, invading this, invading that, attacking, and usually in more modern times, fought back, pushed back. Winston Churchill, in one of his writings in the early 20th century, made a comment where he was personally in battle against an Islamic army. He said the only reason that we survive is our superior technology. And that has remained the same since. But here's what's changed. Instead of overtly attacking us, they just simply move into our countries. And the birth rate in the West, it's terrible. Abortion has part to do with it, and just, I think, a loss of value for family and other things. And that's another topic for another occasion. But the birth rate isn't even 2 human beings, 2 babies per couple. But in Islam, the last I heard, it was something like 7 or 8. And so demographically, just in terms of population, and I think, Islam, Muslims as a people, whether they practice or not, or how committed they are, it's just overwhelming. It's a demographic flood. And so they don't really need to attack anybody. They're just here and they're growing and growing and growing. And they'll make that comment. We're not worried about it. In 1 generation, we'll dominate because we'll simply outnumber you. And that's a big change. In a way, Iran and its crazy determination to destroy Israel, that's an outlier. I think most of Islam says, hey, we're going to win. We just don't need to be impatient about it.
Yeah, that seems like a reflection of the modern turn in most historic religions. I mean, Christianity has been and is frequently critiqued for spreading at the edge of the sword for much of the Constantinian era. But in the modern era, religious tolerance and pluralism and all of this, it's less the case that nations become converted at the edge of the sword and turned over by a change in government. It's more so through organic influence, through growth, and that is, to me, that's a challenge to Christians that gets to our entire sense of identity and understanding as those God created to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, both biologically and in the renewal of that commission and the Great Commission to go and make disciples. If we have a growth problem at the biological and discipleship level, that's something to take very seriously as believers.
I've been a professor for 45 years, and I haven't yet met a group of students, whatever age, that understands what Islam is. They have only the shallowest knowledge. They know, oh yeah, the Quran is their holy book. They have no idea what's in it, how it was written, what its message is. They're stunned when they learn that biblical characters by the dozen are actually referred to, that Jesus himself occurs in it many, many times, that Old Testament stories and some New Testament stories are alluded to. They don't know that. And so most North Americans, Europeans, most in the West do not know what Islam is or what it believes or what it's up to or what its plan. And so the seminar we'll teach in 2 weeks is going to cover that ground. Here are the holy books, especially the Quran. This is what it is. This is how it came about. And this is what it's talking about. And people will be quite surprised. Among other things, they'll find out the Quran denies that Jesus was put to death on the cross.
Right.
And if you accept that, and I've had debates with Muslim clergy who insist on that, if Jesus didn't die on the cross, Christianity has no message.
Yeah.
So that one denial right there eviscerates the whole of the Christian message.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think the anti-Semitism also, if I could just comment on Dr. Steinmetz's really good question, I think the rise of anti-Semitism again has played into right into the hands of theological Islam. We see this happening. We need to discuss it. We will discuss it. I'm disgusted by the lack of Christian voices supporting the Jewish right to exist. When Dr. Evans and I released Jesus and Jihadis during the height of ISIS, there was another group that was being victimized. A genocide was being committed against the Yazidi peoples. And just as vehemently, Dr. Evans and I, and all the media interviews we did, spoke out against the genocide of these Yazidis. Same now with what's happening with the Jewish population. And so I do think that there is a new in vogue Christian movement that doesn't understand any theology of Romans 9 through 11. We'll discuss what Paul meant about salvation is from the Jews, that all Israel will be saved. We forget that our Savior is currently still a Jewish Savior. The Bible is still very much a Jewish book. And so a lot of anti-Semitism now has leaked into Christian thought, and it's playing right into the Muslim hand.
Yes.
Let me insert and remind everyone listening, first of all, TBS students, how blessed you guys are to be able to hear this, because Dr. Evans said 45 years as a professor is yet to meet a student who knew this. So you guys are really blessed and privileged to hear this. But let me just state how much we love Muslims. You guys know I work in the Middle East and various countries. I've got many, many close Muslim friends. We're analyzing a belief system. We're not talking about the value of people. We're not expressing any dislike or hatred toward anyone. We're simply analyzing what is happening on a religious sociological level.
That's a great point. And also, that's why I went back to the religions have a rational text basis. So Islam is a text-based religion. And so we take personality, to the best of our ability, we try to take emotion out of it. And we just look at what are Islam's aims. And there are some things that, again, I think people would benefit from. There are some, can I go into just 5 significant differences very briefly?
Sure.
That this will just whet the appetite for I think our course and why I hope people will be part of it and why these kinds of First Friday conversations that you have, Dr. Stripling, are so important. Number one, the knowability of God. This is a huge difference between the God of Islam and the God of the Bible. You don't know Allah. There is no intimacy with Allah. And yet, what's amazing, what does the prophet Jeremiah say? That I may know God. What is wisdom? That I know him. The knowability of God is a huge distinction. And I become frustrated in the apologetics world when people say, well, all religions are the same. No, as Dr. Evans has put in several books, different religions have different aims and they have different claims. And so Islam has no knowability with God. Number two, there's no intimacy with Allah. There is no intimate connection with Allah. Allah does not love you unconditionally. Allah doesn't even love all Muslims. He only loves the good Muslim. This whole thought that God loves us intimately, when you pull out a passage like Romans 5:8, that God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, with our fist clutched out to God, he sent his son to die for us. There's a huge distinction there between the God of the Bible and the God of Islam. Number three is suffering God. That's a huge distinction that we'll get into. Allah doesn't suffer for anyone. Allah doesn't even know what suffering is in the Islamic writings, in the Sirah, Hadith, and certainly in the Quran. Unconditional versus conditional love. God's love is conditional for the Muslim. The Muslim, therefore, has no assurance of salvation. The Muslim never really knows where he or she stands with Allah, because God's love is totally conditional on your behavior. Have you kept the five pillars? Have you prayed the Shahada 5 times a day? And then finally, the holiness of God. It's interesting to me, there's nothing about God's holiness in the Quran like there is with the God of the Bible. And so those are just 5 things. So Islam doesn't believe in original sin. Muslims don't talk about heaven. They talk about paradise. There's a lot of distinctions there that are simply corruptions of the truth, that we need to bring people back to the truth. And then I think the most powerful chapter in the book is one that Dr. Evans actually wrote, and it was a comparison between Muhammad and Jesus, and between the core teachings of Muhammad and the core teachings of Jesus. And then when you just look on the impact of those, for example, there are 34,000 violent words in the Old Testament. You know, this was a question I've gotten all the time. Well, okay, you talk about violent Islam. Let's talk about the conquest passages in the Old Testament. Well, there's 34,000 violent words. If you were to just pick out like fight or anger or beat or whatever, there's 325,000 violent words in Islam, in the Islamic writing. So, you know, we could do these comparisons all day long. And there's a difference between descriptive narrative and prescriptive narrative. You know, and a lot of the Old Testament is simply descriptive. They're not prescribing us to go have 5 wives because David did. It's just descriptive narrative, whereas the Quran is very much prescriptive narrative. So I've just dumped a lot on you in there, but I wanted to give some of those.
I'm glad you did. That was awesome. I've got questions coming in from listeners right now, and so let me throw out the first one for either one of you. Can take this. Have either of you discussed Islam with Jay Smith? He really knows his stuff. Anybody know about Jay Smith?
I've known Jay very well. Yeah. Go ahead, Doc. Sorry.
We use some of his publications in doing the research for Jesus, John.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, Jay's a good friend. He's invited me to stand on his stool where you can talk negatively about anyone but the Queen. I forget the garden in London where you can do that, but I've never taken him up on it yet. But he's a dear friend, and I actually went to a couple of his courses way back on in seminary.
Okay, so good plug for Jay Smith. This question comes from a TVS student, Janet Fisher. She's from messaging us from California. How does what you see going on in the UK reflect on what you are saying?
Well, I think it's illustrative, and not just in the UK, but in the Netherlands, where
yes.
the Islamic demographic is getting so large, it can be so bold and so daring that it can intimidate people. Even Paris, there are sections of the city of Paris where, beware, the laws of Islam actually are in effect, and women need to be careful by being alone or not dressing properly. So Islamic influence on a cultural level is really flexing its muscles in some places in the UK and continental Europe.
And specifically too with finance, like there are Sharia finance laws in the UK. So we'll get into Sharia law. but there's Sharia finance laws in play with lending in the UK. So it's seeped into every fabric of culture, with I guess with the slight exception of the actual judicial system. They're not cutting off anyone's arms, as far as I know, but Sharia finance laws, and then certainly cultural Sharia is in effect, as Dr. Evans has said. And part of this too is the UK has aborted an entire working class. People like the medical doctor, what's his name? Was it Westminster? D. Martin Lloyd Jones, powerful pastor for years, never ever spoke out against Islam in the whole history, or excuse me, never spoke out against abortion in his whole ministry. It's documented. And so the UK had literally aborted an entire working class. And then they hire all of these individuals from Morocco and others, and then they wonder why they have this growing Islam just demographically in their country. I mean, I sat in a seminar in Oxford and saw these numbers, and also saw the silence of ministers in the 60s and 70s about these cultural issues, and then the infiltration of Islam in the country. This is why these kind of courses we're doing, they do matter. Back to Dr. Israel's question, it is important that we have a conversant faith to, yes, reach people and to hold the line for truth.
Let me make an observation, and then Israel, I'll ask you to kind of build on this. When we see people entering legally or illegally into a country, politically we can have a reaction to that. You know, what do we think immigration policy should be, and so forth. As an American, for example, I can engage in that and have strong opinions about that. But regardless of how people got here, as a Christian, my view should be they're here, and now I'm going to win them for Christ. And whether or not they need to be sent back to their home country and all that, those are sort of larger separate political issues. But we used to worry about sending missionaries out into the world. Now we have these people who need to be reached for Christ who are here. So it's my hope that while we stimulate our minds and learn about Islam, that we also open our hearts to Muslims and how we can bring Christ to them. Israel, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, the complexity of immigration and immigration laws and how that connects to our theology and understanding of Scripture, that's its own series of podcasts, right? But what we know for sure, what should be evident to each of us, is that even if we identify someone as a stranger, a foreigner, an enemy, we have an explicit command from Jesus Christ to love them. Mm-hmm. And that's not a sentimental feeling about them. That is actively blessing, actively demonstrating love to those who are actively cursing us, to those who are actively mistreating us or opposed to us. And so the emphasis on whatever else is happening in terms of politics or law, for Christians to maintain that distinctively Christian identity, to win the world for Christ through love, through evangelism, through service, through humility, through martyrdom, if necessary. We talk a lot in the United States about being willing to kill for our values or ideas or faith. The central conviction of Christianity is being willing to die for those things. Even if someone else is doing evil to us, we don't return evil for evil. We return good for evil. So I think that's a really significant issue. And I'll just say, one testimony that comes to mind, Nabil Qureshi, the former Muslim turned Christian who tragically died very young from stomach cancer. He wrote a series of books, and I read recently his Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and was just so impressed by the reality that his faith in Christ was cultivated by years of friendship with various Christians who demonstrated the love of Christ to him. And he converted to Christ because of the love of Christ's followers. And of course, in the midst of that, there were intellectual arguments and challenges and all sorts of other things. But what led him down the path to meet Jesus was meeting followers of Jesus who loved him.
We've got about 5 minutes to land this ship. So I'm going to give you your last best shot here. If you were going to say to someone, you're going to hate the rest of your life if you don't attend this seminar, okay? So Dr. Evans, give us your last shot. Why should people sign up? It's $89. It's on September the 21st, and it's from 9:30 to 3:30 in the morning. And even if they can't be there live, they can do it virtually and asynchronously. They'll get the link to do it later. So give us your best shot, Dr. Evans.
Okay, well, this will be your chance to find out what the Quran says about Jesus and his disciples and what his ministry was all about, what it really means. It's a very different interpretation, a very different take, but you will find it eye-opening. And it's important for you to know that if you're going to talk to a Muslim, because first of all, Muslims like Jesus. He's a prophet. Muhammad liked him. Muhammad will defend him against critics of Jesus and his mother Mary. But what Muhammad affirms about Jesus, more often than not, is way off base. So if nothing else, please tune in, take it in person or remotely. You'll love the seminar, and you're going to be quite astonished at what Muslims think about Jesus.
We're going to have some copies of y'all's books that day, but if folks want to buy it in advance, when they register, we'll send them a syllabus also. But we have Jesus and the Jihadis. And Craig, what's the name of the other book? That's
Getting Jesus Right.
Getting Jesus Right.
Right.
So if people can read those in advance of the seminar, they'll probably get a lot more out of it, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Johnston, people are going to hate the rest of their life if they don't come to this seminar because
the greatest threat that we face is Islam to the future of our kids and our grandkids' generation. And so back to Dr. Steinmetz's great point a moment ago, if we truly love and want to reach our neighbors and our Muslims for Christ, we need to know something about what they believe. That's 101. And so I'm quite willing to come for 6 hours from 9:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon and just sit and learn from individuals who've won Muslims to Christ. You can listen to a debate that Dr. Evans and I did with Inayat Bungawala, who was publicly supportive of Osama bin Laden after 9/11, and Adnan Rashid, a Hadith scholar. You can listen to that online. You can find that on the World Wide Web. We've been there. We've gone toe-to-toe with some great Muslim thinkers. We've never been more iron-fisted in our faith for Jesus Christ, and we want that for you as well.
Excellent. Dr. Steinmetz, people are going to hate the rest of their life if they don't come because
as Dr. Johnston was laying out a few moments ago in very rapid succession, 5 significant differences, I couldn't help but think about going through foster adoption classes when my wife and I lived in Pasadena, Missouri, and meeting a Muslim couple about our age, early 30s, who were looking to adopt a baby, and talking with him and asking about some of the Muslim practices I had observed. And one is the washings that take place at the mosque before you can go into the worship space. And I asked him, why do you have to wash ritually before every time you enter that space? And he said to me, because I might come in there and it's been dusty and maybe I've got a runny nose and I might have a dried booger in my nostril. And if I step into that holy place and approach Allah with a dried booger in my nostril, that's blasphemous. I need to be ready to face him. And as Dr. Johnston was talking about these core differences, God's unconditional love, God's knowability, God's extension of himself to us in mercy, salvation by grace through faith, I always think back to that poor young man and think about the fact that when my nose was dripping snot onto a carpet as I dealt with mental health problems and spiritual crisis, that's where God met me. He didn't turn away because I had a booger in my nose. And the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ is sometimes best observed when compared and contrasted with the ugliness of false gospels. And so come and hear the true gospel and see one of its bad and tragic twistings in the teachings of Islam.
I remember after 9/11 listening to President Bush misquote the Quran repeatedly. I'm sure it wasn't his fault. He had staff and speechwriters who were, giving him these quotes. But the quote was essentially, he who kills one person, it's as if he killed the whole world. But they're leaving words out of that quote. It was, unless he's an unbeliever. and that tends to change the meaning of the passage. And so what we're hoping to do is to equip you guys with more information, more knowledge, more awareness, so that we can all be a better part of the solution and not of the problem. I have been to the Yarmouk battlefield a number of times in northern Jordan, where the classic battle took place between Christianity and Islam, this watershed moment, this turning point. And I've sat there and just thought about, like, what would have been different if, and what are the ramifications of. And I think these are important things for us to ponder. And God has chosen that we be here at this point in history, that we have a prophetic witness to our generation. And this is an important nexus between Christianity and Islam. And I think it's important that we do this seminar. So thank you, Dr. Evans, for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. Johnston. Are you in Plano, by the way?
I am. So
okay.
God's country up here, where God is a second home, brother.
That's good. Well, I know you're a Chiefs fan instead of a Cowboys fan.
Yes.
And this is problematic, but we do wish you well, brother. And so blessings to you guys. Israel, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everybody on September the 21st for Jesus and the Jihadis.